In your assigned reading, you learned about this principle of conceptual pacts. And I want to give a funny example here about a job that I once worked in, where the organizational structure looked something like this. You can see that the director is listed up here in the corner, and that there are rows of different kinds of research teams that report up to that director. There are also research advisors that report to the director, but these advisors were liaisons between the teams and external client departments who we were helping do research for. So I was on the strategic research team 1, and that team was working with each of the individual advisors to figure out what research needed to be done for other departments. Now, we called these row 1, row 2, row 3 for simplicity, because these names they weren't really articulated well at the beginning. There was some muddiness surrounding the different kinds of research. At first, lots of strategic research was about products, and lots of the product research seemed like it was both summative and formative, and there was just a lot of muddiness around the whole thing. And so the easiest, clearest way to talk about these issues was to call them rows 1, 2, and 3. Eventually, we added also a row 4, which looked like this. So you could see it was a UX research group, and it also had 3 teams. And I've colored this one orange here because they were considered not really research, but they were like field coordinators and supporters. But you could see that after we added this additional row, we had a row 4. Interestingly, we added this row after the organization was no longer conceived in this kind of manner like I'm depicting here. It actually was added when we started depicting everything in columns like this. So you can see that you've got 3 major columns, and the reason why we started depicting it in 3 columns was because we ended up with 3 associate directors. So there was a director over this column, and there was a director over this column, and there was a director over this one. And the problem was, once we ended up with these 3 different columns, there was no clear way of distinguishing the product research group from the strategic, because the whole column was called strategic research, but really, in reality, everybody knew that only these 2 teams were the strategic teams and these 2 teams were the product teams, but the whole thing was called strategic research. And these researchers here got placed under the research support, even though it didn't really make sense. There was just too few people in this column, and so they, instead of adding all the researchers in one group, like in the second column, they just put them in this first group. And so I've colored them orange here, but they're really researchers, and so they should be colored blue. Anyway, it was just convoluted nonsense. But the hilarious thing about this was, related to this idea of conceptual pacts, we continued to call these different groups row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4, even though for 4 years after this reorganization occurred, there was no such thing as a row anymore. We continued to refer to them that way because at one point in our history, we had decided that that would be a sensible way of referring to these different groups. And even once we moved away from that organizational structure, we continued to refer to it in that sensible way because it was the clearest conceptual pact that we could have arrived at. And if we tried to introduce some new word like group or talking about, each of these groups by different kinds of names, then we would have, it would have taken agreement from all the 50 people in the whole division to figure out what we were going to call these different groups and what words we were going to use to refer to them to. And so there's this principle of path dependence, where because we've been going along this path for such a long time, we just continue to do this, refer to these teams in the same ways that we had for a long time, even years and years before. Now, another thing that I'd like to talk about today, as long as we're on the subject of conversations, I feel like it would be a disservice if I didn't address this old myth that communication is, they say, 7% verbal and 93% nonverbal. And You've probably heard that before, but just in case you haven't, I googled this phrase right here, 7% verbal. And you can see there's all these graphs and charts that are depicting this rule of thumb that shows 77% verbal, 38% voice or tone, and 55% body language. And so I'm just going to zoom into one of these as an example, and you can see here that that these are depicted in these different segments of very precise percentages that account for amounts of communication. The problem is, it's total crap. This originated from the misinterpretation of findings from a study that was done back in the 1960s. And in that study, subjects were asked to listen to a recording of a woman's voice saying the word maybe 3 times in different ways that conveyed liking and neutrality and disliking. So that might be something like this. Maybe, maybe, maybe. They were also shown photos, not clip art like I've depicted here, but photos of the supposed woman's face as she was conveying those 3 different emotions of like positive, neutral, and negative. The participants were then asked to guess the emotions that were heard in the recorded voice, as they were only heard or both, or only seen in the photos, or both together, like heard and seen together. In a second study, subjects were asked to listen to 9 recorded words, and 3 were meant to convey liking, like honey, dear, thanks. 3 were meant to be neutral, like maybe, really, oh. And 3 were meant to convey disliking, like don't, brute, terrible. And the thing about the pronunciation of these words was that each word was pronounced in 3 different ways. So like the word honey was pronounced in a positive, a neutral, and a negative way. And the same with all the other words. And when the participants were asked to guess the emotions that were being conveyed by the speaker, it turned out that the subjects were more influenced by the tone of voice than by the actual meaning of the words themselves. And so the statistical results of these 2 studies, the maybe study that I described a second ago, and this study here, were combined, and the researchers came up with this now famous and famously misused rule that communication is only 7% verbal and 93% nonverbal. But as you can see, this set of studies really only addressed the intonation of single words. In real-life dialogue, your words matter much more than your tone of voice. A poorly worded, disorganized argument is still going to be garbage, even if you deliver it enthusiastically. It's just, like we talked about in a recent lesson, it's just so hard for pathos to make up for a lack in logos, for that emotion to make up for logic and rationality. Intonation and body language can be used to emphasize or enhance certain points, or if you want to keep your listener engaged, but it certainly isn't 93% of the conversation. I mean, if you think about how much communication happens when we're writing something, like texts or emails or textbooks or articles or blogs, or so many things in our world we're reading. And yet necessarily when you're reading something, all of the body language and all of the prosody, all of the tone of voice, everything is necessarily removed. But does your understanding of these written things suffer just because you're reading them instead of hearing them? Of course not. Not at all. You can totally understand written communication. Now, I don't know how much of communication really is attributable to nonverbals. That study, the researchers concluded 93%. I don't think there's actually a concrete way of computing exactly how much it should be. But if I had to guess, I might ironically say it's only about 7%, which is how much people have said for a long time is the amount attributable to verbal communication.